The howling wind carried sheets of snow across the Wyoming plains, battering the weathered walls of the small homestead. Ruth pressed her dark hands against the frost-covered window, watching the blizzard rage outside. The winter of 1870 had been the harshest she could remember, and with each passing day, their situation grew more desperate. "Martha," she called to her younger brother, using the name their mother had given him despite what others might expect. "Come away from the door. You'll catch your death in this cold." The boy, barely 12, coughed weakly as he shuffled toward the dying fire. Ruth's heart clenched at the sound. The medicine he needed cost more than they'd seen in months, and with their parents gone these past 3 years, the weight of his care fell entirely on her shoulders. She stirred the thin soup on the stove, mostly water with a few withered vegetables and the last of their salt pork. Their stores were nearly empty, and the cattle they'd managed to keep through the autumn were dying one by one in the brutal cold. Each morning brought new carcasses frozen solid in the snow. A sudden pounding at the door made them both jump. Ruth grabbed the old shotgun from above the mantel, though she knew it held only one shell. In these parts, unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. "Open up, Ruth Washington. I know you're in there." She recognized the voice immediately. Samuel Morrison, the white creditor who held the deed to their land. Her father had borrowed heavily to establish the homestead, believing the promises of prosperity that the frontier offered. But drought, disease, and death had taken their toll, leaving Ruth with debts she could never hope to repay. With trembling hands, she unbarred the door. Morrison stood there with 2 other men, their faces red from cold and drink. Snow swirled around them like angry spirits. "Mr. Morrison," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This is no weather for visiting." He pushed past her into the cabin, his companions following. They tracked mud and snow across the floor she'd swept clean that morning. Morrison's eyes took in the sparse furnishings, the nearly empty shelves, the sick boy huddled by the inadequate fire. 3 months behind on payments," he said without preamble. "I've been more than patient, considering your circumstances." His gaze traveled over her worn dress, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "But patience don't pay my bills." "The spring will bring new calves," Ruth said, though they both knew it was a slim hope. "The land is good. We just need—" "Time," Morrison laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "That's what your daddy said. That's what you said last month. And the month before." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I'm done waiting. You've got 1 week to pay in full, or I'm taking the land and everything on it." "Everything," Ruth's voice caught. She glanced at Martha, who watched with wide, frightened eyes. "The state's got places for orphan boys," one of Morrison's men said with a cruel smile. "Especially sick ones. They'll work it out of him, one way or another." The room spun. Ruth gripped the back of a chair to keep from falling. Without the homestead, they had nothing. And Martha, she couldn't let them take Martha. The boy would die in one of those terrible institutions, worked to death or lost to disease. "Please," she whispered, hating herself for begging. "There must be something." Morrison's expression shifted, becoming something darker and more calculating. "Well now, there might be ways for a woman to earn her keep. You're not uncomely, despite your disadvantages. Dust Creek's got establishments where a woman could make enough to cover her debts, if she's willing." The implications hung in the air like poison. Ruth felt bile rise in her throat. She'd heard whispers of such places, where desperate women sold the only thing they had left. The thought of it made her want to scrub her skin raw. "Get out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 1 week, Morrison repeated, heading for the door. "After that, I'll be back with the sheriff. You think on my words. Girl, sometimes survival means doing things we don't like." The door slammed behind them, leaving Ruth and Martha in silence, broken only by the wind's mournful cry. She sank into the chair, covering her face with her hands. How had it come to this? Her parents had been good people, hardworking and faithful. They'd believed in the promise of the West, in the idea that anyone could make something of themselves with enough determination. "Ruth?" Martha's small voice broke through her despair. "Are we going to lose our home?" She pulled him close, feeling how thin he'd become, how his body shook with each cough. "I won't let that happen," she promised, though she had no idea how to keep her word. That night, as Martha slept fitfully by the dying fire, Ruth sat at the rough table and counted their meager assets by candlelight. 3 chickens that barely laid, 2 cows, both too skinny to sell for much, the old plow horse that could hardly pull anymore, her mother's silver locket, the only valuable thing they owned, and even that wouldn't cover a fraction of what they owed. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence across the plains. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter and stepped outside. The sky had cleared, revealing a canopy of stars that seemed to mock her with their cold beauty. Somewhere out there, people lived in warm houses with full bellies and no fear of tomorrow. But here, in this harsh land that took more than it gave, she stood on the edge of an abyss. She thought of her father's calloused hands as he'd worked this soil, of her mother's songs as she'd tended the garden that first hopeful summer. They'd faced discrimination and hardship with dignity, believing that honest work would see them through. But honesty didn't pay debts, and dignity didn't cure sickness. By the time the sun rose, painting the snow-covered plains in shades of pink and gold, Ruth had made her decision. She would go to Dust Creek. She would find work, any work, that might save their home and keep Martha safe. And if that meant sacrificing her pride, her reputation, even pieces of her soul, then so be it. She prepared Martha's breakfast, the last of the cornmeal made into a thin porridge, and told him she had business in town. His trusting smile nearly broke her resolve. "Will you bring medicine?" he asked hopefully. "I'll try. Sweet boy, I'll try." The ride to Dust Creek took 3 hours through snow and mud. The town sprawled along a dirty main street, false-fronted buildings leaning against each other like drunks, saloons, gambling halls, and establishments of even more dubious reputation lined the thoroughfare. The decent folk hurried past with averted eyes, while others lounged in doorways despite the cold, advertising their wares with painted faces and hollow smiles. Ruth hitched her horse outside the general store, hoping to find any legitimate work first. But the proprietor, a pinched-faced man named Garrett, barely looked up from his ledger. "Got no work for your kind," he said flatly. "Try the saloons. They're always looking for help." She tried the hotel, the restaurant, even the undertaker. The responses ranged from polite refusal to outright hostility. As the day wore on and the sun began its descent toward the mountains, desperation clawed at her throat. Martha needed medicine. They needed food. They needed a miracle that wasn't coming. Finally, as shadows lengthened across the muddy street, Ruth found herself standing outside the Silver Dollar Saloon. Music and laughter spilled from within, along with the smell of whiskey and cheap perfume. She'd reached the end of her options, the place where pride went to die. Taking a breath that tasted of defeat, she pushed through the swinging doors. The noise hit her like a physical force. Piano music, shouting voices, the clink of glasses and coins. Men crowded around tables, playing cards and drinking. Women in low-cut dresses moved between them, smiling and flirting and enduring wandering hands. Every eye turned to her as she entered. A black woman in a respectable dress was an oddity here, a curiosity. She felt their gazes like insects crawling over her skin. Well, a woman's voice drawled. "What have we here?" The speaker emerged from the smoke, an older white woman with henna'd hair and a dress that had seen better decades. Her eyes were shrewd as they assessed Ruth from head to toe. "I'm looking for work," Ruth said, forcing the words past the shame that threatened to choke her. "Are you now?" The woman circled her slowly. "You're pretty enough, though your kind don't usually fetch top dollar. Still, some men have particular tastes. What's your story, girl?" Ruth's hands clenched in her skirts. She thought of Martha's fevered face, of Morrison's threats, of the empty cupboards and dying cattle. I need to pay a debt. My brother is sick. I'll do whatever. The words stuck in her throat. The woman's expression softened slightly. What's your name? Ruth Washington. Well, Ruth Washington. I'm Madame Claire, and this is my establishment. I run a clean place, no rough stuff allowed, and the girls keep half their earnings. But make no mistake about what you're signing up for. This ain't no fairy tale. You come work for me. You leave your dignity at the door. You understand? Ruth nodded, though her soul screamed in protest. But before Madame Claire could say more, a disturbance near the bar drew their attention. A man was arguing with the bartender, his voice rising above the general din. Ruth's desperation had reached such a pitch that the words tumbled from her lips before she could stop them. I'll do anything, she said loudly, her voice carrying across the room. I need to pay my debts. I'll work any way I can. I'll give myself, if that's what it takes. The saloon fell silent. Every face turned to stare at the desperate black woman offering herself like goods at market. Ruth felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she lifted her chin, meeting their gazes with what defiance she could muster. It was then that she noticed him, a man sitting alone in the corner, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Unlike the others, he wasn't leering or laughing. He watched her with an expression she couldn't read, his weathered hands wrapped around a whiskey glass he hadn't touched. Their eyes met across the smoky room, and something passed between them. A recognition of shared pain, perhaps, or simply two souls acknowledging each other's humanity in a place that had little use for such things. He was white, but his clothes marked him as a working man, a cowboy by the look of his worn chaps and dust-covered boots. A scar ran along his jaw, and his eyes held shadows that spoke of violence witnessed and survived. The moment stretched between them until someone laughed, breaking the spell. The saloon erupted back into noise and motion, and Ruth found herself pulled away by Madame Claire, toward a future she'd never imagined and a sacrifice she wasn't sure she could make. But she couldn't shake the image of those quiet eyes watching her from the corner, or the feeling that somehow, in this place of degradation and despair, she'd found something unexpected, a glimmer of understanding in the gathering dark. The cowboy in the corner hadn't moved. While the saloon returned to its cacophony of vice and desperation, he remained still as stone, those weathered hands nursing the same untouched whiskey. Caleb Morgan had seen plenty in his 30-odd years. War, death, the worst men could do to each other. But something about the woman's quiet dignity amid such degradation held his attention. He watched as Madame Claire led Ruth toward the back rooms, noticed how she walked with her spine straight despite the weight crushing her shoulders. The woman's worn dress, carefully mended in several places, spoke of pride maintained against all odds. Her hands, when she'd clenched them at her sides, bore the calluses of hard work, not the soft uselessness of someone looking for easy money. Another whiskey. Caleb, the bartender, Jake, leaned across the scarred wood bar. No. Caleb stood, his spurs jangling softly. Think I've had enough for tonight. He'd come to the Silver Dollar to forget, as he did most nights when the memories grew too sharp. The war had ended 5 years ago, but some battles never truly ceased. In the bottom of a glass, he could sometimes find temporary peace from the faces of men he'd killed. Boys, really, wearing gray instead of blue. But tonight, watching Ruth Washington offer herself like a sacrifice on the altar of survival, he felt something shift inside him, a stirring of the man he'd been before bullets and bayonets had carved away pieces of his soul. Morrison was already moving toward Ruth, his thick fingers reaching for her arm. Well, seems you've come to your senses after all. Girl! Madame Claire, I'll pay extra for first rights to this one. The words hit Caleb like a slap. He knew Morrison, a vulture who fed on others' misfortune, buying up failed homesteads for pennies on the dollar. The man had grown fat on others' dreams, and now he sought to feast on this woman's desperation. The lady hasn't agreed to anything yet, Caleb said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. He'd moved without conscious thought, placing himself between Morrison and the two women. Morrison's face flushed red. This ain't your business. Morgan, the girl owes me money. She's here to pay it back the only way she can. Funny thing about debts, Caleb said conversationally, though his hand rested easy near his holster. They can be paid lots of ways. Maybe the lady just needs time to explore her options. The saloon had gone quiet again, sensing violence in the air like animals before a storm. Morrison's two companions pushed back their chairs, hands drifting toward their guns. Caleb smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. You really want to do this over a business transaction? Morrison? Seems mighty foolish, bleeding all over Madame Claire's nice floor. You threatening me, Morgan? Just observing. Man bleeds quite a bit when he's shot. Seen it plenty during the war. Makes an awful mess. Ruth watched this exchange with wide eyes, torn between hope and suspicion. Why would this stranger intervene? What did he want from her? In her experience, white men who played savior always expected payment of their own. Madame Claire, sensing profit slipping away, interjected smoothly. Gentlemen, please. This is a place of business, not a battleground. Mr. Morrison, if the girl chooses to work here, you'll wait your turn like any other customer. And Mr. Morgan, if you're interfering with my commerce, I'm offering to hire Mrs. Washington for different work, Caleb said, never taking his eyes off Morrison. Legitimate work. My ranch needs a cook and housekeeper. The pay's fair, and she can bring her brother. Ruth's breath caught. You don't even know me. For the first time, Caleb looked directly at her, and she saw depths of pain that matched her own. I know desperation when I see it, ma'am, and I know courage, too. Takes both to walk into a place like this and keep your head high. Morrison laughed ugly. You think she's going to choose cooking and cleaning over what she could make here? You offering to pay her debts, Morgan? Because that's what it'll take. $500, plus interest. The sum hit Ruth like a physical blow. $500. It might as well have been $5,000. Her father had borrowed $150 to start the homestead. How had it grown to such an impossible amount? Compound interest, Morrison said, reading her expression. Your daddy should have read the fine print. Now, you coming with me, girl? Or do I call in the sheriff tomorrow? Caleb stepped closer to Morrison, close enough that the other man could see the cold promise in his eyes. You'll get your money, he said quietly. But not tonight, and not from her working upstairs. I'll stand as guarantor for the debt. Give her 6 months to pay it proper. You'll stand as guarantor? Morrison scoffed. With what? That broken-down ranch you're drinking yourself to death on? Your word ain't worth spit, Morgan. Something dangerous flickered across Caleb's face. He reached into his vest and pulled out a leather pouch, dropping it on the nearest table with a heavy thunk. Gold coins spilled across the scarred wood, gleaming in the lamplight. There's $50 there, he said. Down payment on the debt. You'll get the rest as agreed. Or you can take the ranch. But you leave Mrs. Washington alone. The room held its breath. Ruth stared at the gold. More money than she'd seen in years. Then at the man who'd thrown it down so casually. Who was this cowboy who carried gold and faced down predators without flinching? Morrison's greed wrestled with his cruelty, and greed won. He scooped up the coins with thick fingers. 6 months, he agreed. But if you default, Morgan, I take your ranch and hers, and the girl still ends up where she belongs. After Morrison and his men left, counting their gold and laughing, the saloon slowly returned to life. Madame Claire shrugged philosophically and moved on to other prospects. But Ruth remained frozen, staring at Caleb Morgan like he was some impossible dream she'd conjured from despair. Why? She whispered. He settled his hat on his head, suddenly seeming uncomfortable with her scrutiny. Like I said, I need help at the ranch. Been letting things go too long. You need honest work. I need someone who knows how to work honest. Seems simple enough. Nothing simple when it comes to people like me and people like you. Maybe not, he agreed. But it's getting late, and that storm's going to get worse before morning. You got a place to stay tonight? She shook her head. The ride back to the homestead through a blizzard would be dangerous, possibly deadly. But staying in town meant spending money she didn't have. There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Chen runs a clean place, doesn't ask questions. Tell her Caleb Morgan's paying. He turned to leave, then paused. Meet me at the livery stable tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. We'll discuss terms proper. Mr. Morgan, Ruth started. But he was already pushing through the saloon doors into the night. She stood there among the smoke and sin, feeling like she'd stepped from one dream into another. The desperation that had driven her here still gnawed at her bones. But now it was tempered with something else, a fragile hope she didn't quite dare name. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent as secrets. Ruth pulled her thin shawl tight and made her way through the muddy streets to Mrs. Chen's boarding house. The Chinese woman asked no questions, just as Caleb had promised, simply showing Ruth to a small but clean room with a bed that had actual sheets. Ruth sat on the edge of that bed and, for the first time in months, allowed herself to weep. She cried for her parents, for Martha's sickness, for the dignity she'd almost sold, and she cried for the unexpected kindness of a scarred cowboy who'd looked at her and seen something worth saving. In the morning, she'd learned what price came with that salvation. Men always wanted something, and she'd learned not to trust what seemed too good to be true. But tonight, in this clean room with the snow falling soft outside, she could pretend that miracles still happened in this harsh land. Across town, Caleb Morgan sat in his own rented room, staring at the whiskey bottle he hadn't opened. He'd acted on instinct in the saloon, driven by something he couldn't name. The woman's eyes had held a familiar desperation, the look of someone watching everything they'd built slip away. He'd worn that same expression after the war, before whiskey had numbed the edges. Now he'd pledged his ranch, the only thing he had left, for a stranger's debt. His few friends would call him a fool. Maybe he was. But something about Ruth Washington had pierced through the fog he'd lived in these past years. Her courage in that den of degradation had shamed his own cowardice, hiding in a bottle while the world moved on without him. He thought about tomorrow, about what he'd say when she showed up at the livery stable, if she showed up. The ranch did need help. That wasn't a lie. But helping her meant opening doors he'd barred shut, letting another person into the careful emptiness he'd cultivated. The snow continued to fall, covering the ugly town in temporary white. By morning, Dust Creek would look almost clean, almost like a place where fresh starts were possible. Caleb finally opened the whiskey, but only poured one drink, raising it to the window where snow swirled like spirits in the darkness. To foolish chances, he murmured, and drained the glass. Tomorrow would bring its own complications. Ruth would be wary. Rightfully so. He'd have to prove his intentions were honorable, that he wasn't just another predator in different clothing. And somehow, they'd have to find a way to pay Morrison's blood debt without losing everything. But tonight, in the silence of falling snow, both Ruth and Caleb allowed themselves the dangerous luxury of hope, in a land that broke dreams as easily as bones. Sometimes, hope was all that kept a person standing, and sometimes, just sometimes, it was enough to build something new from the wreckage of what was lost. Dawn broke gray and bitter cold over the Wyoming plains. Ruth had barely slept, her mind churning over the previous night's events. She rose before sunrise, washed her face in the icy water from the pitcher, and tried to smooth the wrinkles from her dress. Whatever Caleb Morgan's true intentions, she would meet them with dignity intact. The walk to the livery stable took her through streets turned to thick mud by snow and traffic. Early morning Dust Creek showed its true face. Drunks sleeping in doorways, garbage frozen in alleyways, the painted women from the saloons stumbling home with hollow eyes. Ruth kept her head high, though she felt the weight of what she'd almost become. Caleb was already there, checking the shoes on a bay mare. He looked different in daylight, older, perhaps, the lines around his eyes deeper, that scar along his jaw more prominent. But his hands were gentle on the horse, and he spoke to it in low, soothing tones that made something inside Ruth unknot slightly. "Mrs. Washington." He straightened, touching his hat brim. "Glad you came. Did you think I wouldn't?" "Wouldn't have blamed you. What I offered last night might have seemed like trading one trap for another." His directness surprised her. She'd expected games, verbal dancing around intentions. "And is it a trap?" Caleb considered this, running a hand along the mare's neck. "Suppose that depends on what you're looking for. The work's real, cooking, cleaning, mending. Ranch has gone to seed since—" He paused, something flickering across his face. "Since I've been alone. Pays $20 a month plus room and board for you and your brother. Fair warning, though, the place ain't much, and winter's going to be hard." "Winter's already hard? Mr. Morgan." "Caleb," he corrected. "And you're right. Let me show you what you'd be getting into." They rode out together, Ruth on her old plow horse and Caleb on his bay. The storm had passed, leaving the world crystalline and sharp-edged. Their breath clouded in the frigid air, and Ruth was grateful for the movement that warmed her blood. "Your brother," Caleb said after they'd ridden in silence for a while. "He's sick. Lung fever. Comes and goes. But this winter—" She couldn't finish. "There's a doctor in Cheyenne who's good with lung ailments. Studied back east. Expensive. But he knows his business. Expensive puts him out of reach." "Maybe not, once we get the ranch producing again." Ruth studied his profile, trying to read this enigmatic man who spoke of productivity, while his clothes showed careful mending and his boots needed new soles. "Why did you really help me last night?" Caleb was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, "You ever done something that haunts you, Mrs. Washington? Something that changes who you are down to the bones?" "Yes." "Then maybe you understand. Sometimes a man needs to do something decent, just to prove he still can." They crested a rise, and Caleb's ranch spread before them. Ruth's heart sank. The place looked like a photograph of abandoned dreams. The main house listed slightly, its roof patched with different materials. The barn door hung crooked, and what fencing she could see needed major repairs. Snow covered the worst, but she could tell the fields hadn't been properly worked in seasons. "I warned you, it wasn't much," Caleb said quietly. "It's still standing," Ruth replied. "That's more than some can say." They rode down to the house, and Caleb helped her dismount. Inside was better than she'd feared. Dusty and neglected, but structurally sound. A large kitchen with a good stove, a main room with a stone fireplace, 2 bedrooms. The furniture was sparse, but well made. "My father built this place in '58, Caleb said, running his hand over a wooden beam. "Meant it to last. Just hasn't had proper care lately." Ruth moved through the rooms, her practical eye cataloging what needed doing. Cleaning first, obviously. The windows were so dirty barely any light got through. The stove needed blacking, the floors scrubbing. But underneath the neglect, she saw possibility. "Where would my brother and I stay?" "The back bedroom. I'll bunk in the barn. There's a room fixed up there from when we had hands." "That's not necessary." "It is," he said firmly. "People talk. You're a respectable woman, and I mean to keep it that way. Your reputation's already going to take a beating. Working for a single man, no need to make it worse." Ruth felt something ease in her chest. Whatever else Caleb Morgan was, he understood propriety and the extra burden she carried as a black woman in a white man's world. They spent the morning touring the property. Despite the disrepair, Ruth saw the ranch's bones were good. The well-produced clear water, the root cellar was dry and sound, and the barn, while needing work, could shelter animals properly. Caleb had a dozen cattle, scrawny but alive, and a small remuda of horses. "Used to run over 100 head, he said, looking out over the snow-covered pastures. "Before the war. Had 3 hands then, and my father to manage things." "Where is your father now?" "Cemetery in town, next to my mother. Died while I was gone." The flatness in his voice spoke of old grief, scarred over but still tender. Ruth understood that kind of pain. "I'll need supplies." she said, steering the conversation to practical matters. Cleaning materials, food staples, medicine for Martha, for my brother. Make a list. We'll go to town tomorrow. He paused. About Morrison and the debt. I won't have you ruining yourself for my troubles. Already done, haven't I? Stood as guarantor. My ranch is on the line now, too. Then we'd better make this work. The simple determination in her voice made him look at her fully. Afternoon sun slanted through the dirty windows, highlighting the strength in her face, the stubborn set of her jaw. She'd taken in his broken-down ranch and seen not failure, but possibility. Maybe that's what he'd recognized in her at the saloon, another stubborn soul who refused to let circumstances dictate surrender. They rode back to town as evening approached, at Ruth's small homestead. Caleb helped her gather necessities while she explained the situation to Martha. The boy watched him with suspicious eyes, protective of his sister despite his weakness. You're the man from the saloon, Martha said, then caught himself. Ruth told me. Martha! Ruth's voice was sharp with warning. It's all right, Caleb said. Boy's got a right to be cautious. Yes, I was there. Your sister's coming to work for me, cooking and keeping house. You'll both stay at my ranch where it's warmer and there's proper food. Why would you help us? Martha's young voice held an adult's wariness. Caleb considered the boy, thin, pale, but with his sister's same stubborn spirit. Because I need the help, and your sister needs the work. Sometimes things line up simple as that. They loaded what they could on the horses, clothes, a few precious belongings, Ruth's mother's Bible and cooking pots. The rest would have to wait, as they prepared to leave. Ruth took one last look at the homestead her parents had built. We'll come back for the rest, Caleb said quietly. Will we? She didn't mean the belongings. He understood. This land's still yours. We'll find a way to keep it. The ride back to Caleb's ranch was slow. Martha bundled in blankets on the horse with Ruth. The boy was coughing again. Harsh sounds that echoed in the cold air. Caleb pushed ahead to get fires started and beds ready. By the time they arrived, warm light spilled from the windows and smoke rose from the chimney. It wasn't much, a neglected ranch house with a damaged man and a desperate woman trying to salvage something from ruins. But it was shelter. That night, Ruth tucked Martha into the first real bed he'd had in months and listened to his breathing slowly ease. In the kitchen, she found Caleb had left supplies laid out for breakfast and a note. Barn, if you need anything, welcome home. See, home. The word sat strange in her mind. This wasn't home. It was a bargain, a business arrangement born of desperation. But as she sat by the fire, warming herself for the first time in weeks, Ruth allowed herself to imagine it might become something more. Outside, in the barn's converted room, Caleb lay on a narrow cot and stared at the rafters. He could hear the wind picking up again, rattling the loose boards. Come spring, there'd be endless work, fencing, planting, gathering the cattle that had wandered. Work he'd let slide in his whiskey-soaked grief. But now there were voices in his house again. Life in the empty rooms. He'd acted on impulse, saving Ruth Washington from Morrison's clutches. But maybe in doing so, he'd saved something in himself, too. The ranch would demand everything they had to give, and Morrison would circle like a vulture, waiting for them to fail. There were no guarantees except hard work and harder choices. Still, for the first time in years, Caleb felt something besides numbing despair. It might have been hope, or it might have been fear. Sometimes they felt the same in the dark. Either way, it meant he was still alive enough to feel, and that was a start. In the house, Ruth banked the fire and made her own bed. Tomorrow would bring 1,000 challenges. But tonight, her brother slept safe and warm, and she hadn't sold her soul to pay for it. Sometimes salvation came in unexpected forms, a scarred cowboy with gentle hands and shadows in his eyes, offering not rescue but partnership in survival. The wind sang through the gaps in the walls, a lonesome sound that seemed to carry all the sorrow of the plains. But inside, 3 broken people had found shelter together, and that was its own kind of miracle in this unforgiving land. Ruth fell asleep to the sound of her brother's steady breathing. Her last thought a prayer of gratitude for unexpected grace and the strange turnings of fate that had brought them to this imperfect sanctuary. The real work would begin tomorrow. Tonight. It was enough to be warm, to be safe, to have hope. The peace lasted exactly 3 weeks. Ruth had just pulled fresh bread from the oven when she heard the thunder of hooves approaching. Through the newly cleaned windows, she saw them, Morrison and 5 men, all armed, their faces hard with purpose. Her hands tightened on the bread pan. "Martha, go to your room," she said quietly. "But Ruth, now." The boy disappeared as the riders pulled up in the yard. Caleb emerged from the barn, his movements careful and deliberate. Ruth noticed he'd strapped on his gun belt, something he rarely did around the ranch. "Morrison." Caleb nodded. "Bit early for social calls." "This ain't social." Morrison dismounted, his hand resting on his pistol. "Heard you been selling cattle in town. My cattle, way I see it, since this ranch is collateral on the debt." "Those cattle carried my brand," Caleb said evenly. "Needed the money for supplies and medicine." "Medicine for that darky brat?" Morrison spat tobacco juice into the snow. "Waste of good money. Boy's gonna die anyway. Way he coughs." Ruth stepped onto the porch, the old shotgun in her hands. "Get off our land." Morrison's laugh was ugly. "Your land? Girl, you got no land. You got nothing but what I allow you to have." His eyes traveled over her, lingering. "Though you clean up nice, been thinking maybe we could work out a different arrangement after all." The original arrangement stands. Caleb moved closer to the porch, placing himself between Morrison and Ruth. $350 in 5 months' time. $450, Morrison corrected. "Interest keeps running. Maybe you can't count so good, Morgan. Or maybe you're too distracted by your new house guest." He grinned at his men, who chuckled. "Boy's been talking. Black woman living with a white man, even with her brat brother as chaperone. Ain't proper." "Nothing improper about hired help." Caleb's voice carried warning. "That what you calling it?" Morrison stepped closer. "See, I think you got yourself confused. Think you're some kind of hero, saving the poor negress from her fate. But we both know how this ends. You can't make that payment. And when you default, I take both properties. And then little Ruth here ends up right where she was headed anyway." One of Morrison's men, younger than the others with mean eyes, added, "Maybe we don't need to wait. Maybe we take a down payment now." The click of Ruth cocking the shotgun echoed in the cold air. "First man steps foot on this porch gets both barrels." "You'd shoot white men for defending what's ours?" Morrison asked. "I'd shoot any man who threatens my home," Ruth replied steadily. The tension stretched taut. Caleb's hand hovered near his Colt, calculating odds. 6 men, all armed. Ruth had 1, maybe 2 shots. Martha was safe inside, but for how long? "Tell you what," Morrison said finally. "I'm feeling generous. You got 1 month to make your first payment, $100, or I come back with the sheriff and legal papers. And Morgan, next time you want to sell cattle, you ask permission first." They mounted up and rode out, but not before the young one made an obscene gesture at Ruth. She stood on the porch until they were out of sight, then finally lowered the shotgun with shaking hands. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes. We don't have $100. We'll get it." She turned to him, frustration and fear warring in her eyes. "How?" "The cattle money went for supplies and Martha's medicine. There's nothing left to sell." Caleb removed his hat, running fingers through hair that needed cutting. "There's a horse drive coming through next week. Army remounts heading to Fort Laramie. They'll need extra hands." "They'll pay you enough." "If I can stick it out. It's dangerous work." He met her eyes. "I'll need you to manage things here. Can you handle a rifle?" "Better than most." "Good, because Morrison might not wait." That night, after Martha was asleep, they sat by the fire planning. Ruth had transformed the house in 3 weeks. Windows gleamed, floors shone, and the smell of good cooking had replaced the musty odor of neglect. She'd even coaxed some order into Caleb's appearance, mending his clothes and insisting he shave regularly. Why are you doing this? Ruth asked suddenly. Really, you could walk away. Let Morrison take this place and start fresh somewhere else. Caleb stared into the fire. My father built this ranch, fought Indians and weather and everything else to make something from nothing. I let it fall apart after the war, crawled into a bottle and hid. Then you showed up, ready to sacrifice everything for your brother. And I thought, he paused. I thought maybe God was giving me a chance to do something right. I'm not your redemption, Caleb Morgan. No, he agreed. But maybe we can be each other's survival. The horse drive arrived on schedule. 100 head of half-wild Mustangs needing to reach Fort Laramie before the next big storm. The trail boss, a weathered man named Hutchinson, looked Caleb over with knowing eyes. You're that Morgan boy. Heard you came back from the war touched in the head. I can work, Caleb said simply. Can you stay sober? Yes. $30 for 2 weeks' work. If you last, half the men don't. These ain't broke horses. Morgan, they're mean as snakes and twice as likely to kill you. I'll take it. Ruth watched him ride out, anxiety gnawing at her stomach. 2 weeks alone with Martha, managing the ranch and watching for Morrison. She gripped the rifle Caleb had left, its weight both comforting and frightening. The first week passed quietly. Ruth fell into a routine. Morning chores, tending the remaining cattle, keeping the fires burning. Martha seemed stronger, the warm house and regular meals working their healing magic. In the evenings, she taught him to read from her mother's Bible, the only book they had, but isolation wore on her. No visitors came except the wind, and at night she heard wolves howling in the distance. She found herself listening for hoofbeats, both dreading and hoping for Caleb's return. On the 8th day, riders appeared on the horizon. Ruth's heart jumped, then sank as she recognized Morrison's younger companion from before, along with 2 others. Not Morrison himself, that would have been too direct, just his dogs, come to sniff around. Afternoon, miss, the young one called, dismounting at the gate. Just checking to see how you're managing, all alone out here. I'm not alone, Ruth said from the porch, rifle visible but not raised. No? Where's Morgan then? Working. He'll be back directly. Sure he will. The man grinned. Meanwhile, maybe we could come in, warm ourselves by your fire, neighborly-like. You're not neighbors, and you're not welcome. His face hardened. Unfriendly, mister. Morrison won't like hearing that. Mister, Morrison can hear whatever he likes, long as he hears it off this property. They circled the house slowly, like wolves testing for weakness. Ruth followed their movement from inside. Martha pressed against her side. Ruth, I'm scared, the boy whispered. Shh. They're just trying to frighten us. But her own heart hammered as she watched them examine the barn, the corral, looking for ways in. Finally, as dusk approached, they mounted up. The young one called out, You tell Morgan we were here, tell him we'll be back, and next time, maybe you'll be more hospitable. They rode off laughing. Ruth barred the doors and checked the windows, then sat up through the night with the rifle across her lap. Martha slept fitfully beside her, coughing in his dreams. Dawn came slowly, painting the frost-covered windows pink. Ruth's eyes burned from sleeplessness, but she couldn't rest. Somewhere out there, Caleb was wrestling wild horses for $30. Here, she wrestled with fear and the knowledge that this was just the beginning. On the 10th day, Martha's fever returned with a vengeance. Ruth used the last of the medicine, bathed his burning forehead, and prayed. The boy mumbled in delirium, calling for their mother. Ruth held him close, singing the lullabies she remembered, feeling more alone than she'd ever been. That night, the wolves came closer. She could see their eyes reflecting in the darkness beyond the porch. They'd scented weakness, the sick boy, the lone woman, the isolation, just like Morrison and his men. But Ruth Washington had not survived this long by surrendering to predators. She built up the fires, loaded both the rifle and shotgun, and settled in for another sleepless night. Outside, the wind howled its familiar song of desolation. Inside, She held her brother and refused to let fear win. "We're going to make it?" she whispered to Martha's fevered face. "Caleb will come back. We'll pay Morrison. You'll get well. We're going to make it." The words were as much prayer as promise. In this harsh land where hope was currency and survival the only real wealth, Ruth spent everything she had on belief. Somewhere in the darkness, wolves howled and evil men plotted. But here, in this imperfect shelter, love stood guard with a loaded rifle and a stubborn heart. The 11th day dawned clear and cold. Ruth, exhausted beyond measure, almost didn't hear the hoofbeats until they were close. She grabbed the rifle, then recognized the bay mare's gait. Caleb had returned. He dismounted stiffly, moving like an old man. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, but his eyes were clear. $30, he said, pressing the money into her hands. "And Hutchinson says there's another drive in spring. If we make it that long." Ruth's composure finally cracked. "Martha's sick. Morrison's men came. I haven't slept in 3 days and—" "Hey!" Caleb steadied her with hands gentle despite their cuts and bruises. "You held on. That's what matters. Now let me help." Together they tended Martha, Caleb producing medicine from his saddlebags that he'd bought with his own wages. As the boy's fever broke and he fell into healing sleep, Ruth found herself crying from sheer relief. "This is what it's going to be, isn't it?" she said. "Fighting for every inch, every day." "Yes," Caleb said simply. "But we're still here, still fighting. That's something." In the warmth of the kitchen, with danger temporarily at bay and $30 toward an impossible debt, Ruth felt the truth of it. They were still here, still fighting, in this unforgiving land. Sometimes that was the only victory that mattered. Tomorrow would bring new battles. Morrison would return. The ranch needed work. The debt loomed like a mountain. But tonight, they were together, damaged but not defeated. 3 souls making a stand against the darkness. And sometimes, in the wild heart of Wyoming, that was enough. The whispers started as soon as the snow began to melt. Ruth first heard them at the general store, where women stopped talking when she entered, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and scandal. The storekeeper, Mr. Garrett, who'd once refused her work, now served her with exaggerated politeness that felt worse than hostility. "Will that be on Mr. Morgan's account?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yes." Ruth kept her voice steady, though shame burned her cheeks. Behind her, she heard the whispers start again. "Living in sin. That poor child. What example? Would you expect anything else from her kind?" Ruth gathered her supplies with trembling hands. 3 months she'd been at Caleb's ranch, 3 months of hard work and careful propriety. And still the town had made its judgment. A black woman living with a white man, no matter the circumstances, could only mean one thing in their minds. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual. Martha waited on the porch, his health much improved, but his eyes worried. "Ruth, why were those boys throwing stones?" She had known about that. "What boys?" "From town. They came by while you were gone. Said things." He looked down. "Bad things. About you and Mr. Caleb." Rage flared in her chest, hot and helpless. "You stay away from town boys. You hear? They don't know anything about us." That evening, Caleb returned from checking the fence line to find Ruth scrubbing the kitchen floor with violent energy. He'd learned to read her moods these past months, to recognize when the weight of their situation pressed heaviest. "What happened?" "Nothing." She didn't look up. "Supper's keeping warm." He knelt beside her, stilling her hands. "Ruth?" The kindness in his voice undid her. The whole town thinks I'm your—" She couldn't say the word. "They're throwing stones at Martha, calling us names, and I can't even defend myself because what would be the point? A black woman's word against their assumptions?" Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd tried to shield them from the worst of the gossip, taking on the town interactions himself when possible. But poison had a way of seeping through cracks. "I'll speak to the sheriff about the boys," he said. Ruth laughed bitterly. "The sheriff? You think he cares what happens to us?" They were interrupted by hoofbeats. Through the window, Ruth saw a lone rider approaching, a black man in worn clothes but riding a good horse. Visitors were rare enough. A black visitor was unprecedented. The man introduced himself as Josiah Freeman, a preacher making his rounds through the colored settlements scattered across Wyoming. He'd heard about Ruth in town and came to offer counsel. "Sister," he said after Caleb had excused himself to the barn, "I don't judge your choices. Lord knows we all do what we must to survive. But I worry for your soul, and for the boy." "My soul is my own business," Ruth said stiffly. "And there's nothing improper happening here. I work for Mr. Morgan, that's all." "That may be truth," Josiah said gently. "But truth and perception walk different roads. The colored community in Laramie, small as it is, they talk. Some say you've forgotten yourself, taking up with a white man. Others say you're doing what's necessary. But all agree it reflects on all of us." "Reflects?" Ruth's voice rose. "I'm trying to keep my brother alive, keep a roof over our heads. I work from dawn to past dark, and I've never compromised myself. How does that reflect badly on anyone? Because we're held to different standards. Sister, always have been. When one of us falls, they say we all fall. When one of us rises wrong, they use it against the rest." After he left, Ruth sat alone in the kitchen while darkness gathered. She understood his meaning too well. In choosing survival, she'd become a story others would tell, a cautionary tale or a confirmation of prejudices. Either way, she'd lost control of her own narrative. Caleb found her there hours later, still sitting in the dark. "The preacher give you trouble?" "No, just truth." She looked at him across the table. "This arrangement is hurting your reputation, too. A war veteran, consorting with a black woman. What does the town say about you?" "Nothing I haven't heard before." He lit the lamp, casting warm light between them. "Ruth, I need to tell you something. Morrison's been spreading particular lies. Says he has witnesses who've seen us. Together. Says it proves you're working off your debt the way he first suggested." Ruth felt sick. Who believes him? Does it matter? Those inclined to think ill will think it regardless. "It matters to me," she said fiercely. "My parents raised me right. Just because I'm poor doesn't mean I'm without morals. Just because I'm black doesn't mean I'm available for any man's story." "I know that. Do you?" She stood abruptly. "Because sometimes I catch you looking at me. Caleb Morgan. And I don't know what you see. The help? A charity case? A woman?" The question hung between them, dangerous and honest. These months of working side by side had built something. Friendship, certainly. Partnership in survival. But underneath ran a current neither had acknowledged, made more fraught by their circumstances and the world's watching eyes. "I see," Caleb said slowly. "Someone who makes this empty house feel like home again. Someone who faces each impossible day with courage I lost somewhere in the war. I see a woman. Yes, but more than that, I see Ruth." She turned away. Emotions too complex for words. Outside. Coyotes called to each other across the darkness, their cries echoing the loneliness that pressed against the windows. "We can't," she whispered. "Whatever this is, we can't." It would prove them all right. It would destroy what little reputation I have left. I'm not asking for anything. "Aren't you?" She faced him then. "Every kindness, every soft word, every time you defend me in town. What are you not asking for? Caleb?" He had no answer. The truth was too complicated, that he'd started by wanting to help, to do one good thing in a life marked by violence. But somewhere between her first batch of cornbread and the way she sang while hanging laundry, something had shifted. He looked forward to her morning greeting, sought excuses to linger in the kitchen, found himself working harder because he wanted to see her smile. "Morrison made his move today," he said instead, changing the subject. "He's calling in the debt, full payment in 30 days, or he takes both properties." Ruth sank back into her chair. "We have $90 saved, and I can get maybe 50 for the horses. Still leaves us 300 short." They sat in silence. the weight of impossibility settling over them like a shroud. All their work, all their careful scrimping, and still the mountain was too high to climb. "There's a cattle buyer coming through next week," Caleb said finally. "Might could sell the whole herd. Such as it is, that would get us close, and leave us with nothing to rebuild on. Better than losing everything." Ruth thought of the homestead where her parents lay buried, of the dreams they'd planted in that unforgiving soil. She thought of Martha, finally healthy enough to help with chores, to imagine a future. She thought of this kitchen where she'd found a kind of peace despite everything. "The preacher said something else," she said quietly. "Said there's a settlement near Laramie, colored folks, making their own way. Said they'd welcome us." Caleb went very still. "Is that what you want?" "What I want?" Ruth laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I want to not owe money to evil men. I want my brother to grow up strong and educated. I want to walk through town without shame. I want—" She stopped. "What?" His voice was gentle. "I want impossible things," she finished. "Things that don't belong to women like me. You could file claim on government land," Caleb said carefully. "Start fresh, away from Morrison and the gossip." "With what? How would we survive the first winter? And what about you? Morrison will still take this place." "This place was already lost," Caleb said. "I was just too stubborn to see it. At least this way. You and Martha have a chance." Ruth studied him in the lamplight, this broken man who'd offered her shelter when the world would have seen her destroyed, who maintained careful distance even as something unspoken grew between them, who would sacrifice his father's legacy to give her a fresh start. "We're not running," she said firmly. "We've worked too hard to run now. We'll face Morrison together, whatever comes." "Ruth?" "No." She stood, determination replacing despair. "The town can gossip, the preacher can judge, Morrison can threaten, but we've made something here, the three of us. Maybe it doesn't look like what others expect, maybe it doesn't fit their ideas of proper, but it's ours, and I won't let shame or fear take it away." Caleb looked at her, this woman who'd walked into a saloon ready to sell herself for her brother's life, who'd faced down armed men with a shotgun, who'd transformed his hollow existence into something worth fighting for. The world would never understand what they were to each other. Sometimes he didn't understand it himself. "All right," he said. "We fight." That night, as Ruth lay in her narrow bed listening to Martha's peaceful breathing, she thought about perception and truth, about the stories others told and the life actually lived. Tomorrow the town would still whisper. Morrison would still circle like a vulture. The debt would still loom. But tonight, in this imperfect shelter they'd built from necessity and grown into something like home, she chose to believe in impossible things, not fairy tale endings or sudden rescues, but the quiet impossible of daily survival, of dignity maintained against all odds, of connection that transcended what the world allowed. The coyotes had gone silent, and stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Ruth closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for miracles, but for strength to face whatever tomorrow brought. In this unforgiving land, that was its own kind of faith. The drought arrived with the first heat of summer, turning the grasslands brown and brittle. Ruth watched the sky each day, searching for clouds that never came. The creek that fed their water supply dwindled to a trickle, then dried completely. Their carefully tended garden withered despite her efforts to haul water from the well. "We're losing them," Caleb said, standing among the dying cattle. 3 had collapsed that morning, their ribs showing stark through hide. "Another week of this heat and they'll all be gone." Ruth wiped sweat from her brow, her dress already soaked through despite the early hour. "How much would Morrison give us for them now?" "Nothing. He wants us to fail." Caleb removed his hat, running fingers through hair gone too long. "He's buying up water rights all over the county. Man's getting rich off others' misery." That afternoon, as temperatures soared past what any living thing should endure, Martha came running from the pasture. "Ruth, Mr. Caleb, smoke!" They saw it then, a black column rising from the direction of town. In drought conditions, fire was everyone's nightmare. Ruth's first thought was for their own vulnerability, the dry wood of house and barn like tinder waiting for a spark. "Stay here," Caleb ordered, already saddling his horse. "Keep Martha close and wet down the buildings if the wind shifts." He rode off toward the smoke. Ruth and Martha spent the afternoon hauling bucket after bucket from the well, soaking the walls and roof as best they could. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Ruth felt dizzy from heat and exhaustion. Near sunset, riders appeared on the horizon. Ruth grabbed the rifle, then recognized Caleb's bay among them. He returned with 3 other men, their faces grim and soot-stained. "The Hendricks place," he reported. "Burned to the ground. They lost everything." The Hendricks family, a white couple with 4 children who'd always treated Ruth with cold courtesy, were now homeless, despite their past slights. Ruth's heart ached for them. "Bring them here," she said. Caleb looked surprised. "Ruth, they've never been kind." "Kindness isn't about deserving," she interrupted. "We have room." That night, their household swelled to 9 people. Mrs. Hendricks sat silent and shocked while her children huddled close. Mr. Hendricks had burns on his hands from trying to save their belongings. Ruth tended the burns with gentle efficiency, then served what supper she could manage with their dwindling supplies. The Hendricks children, who'd thrown stones and insults in town, now ate her food with grateful tears. "Why, Mrs. Hendricks finally asked. After everything, because it's right," Ruth said simply. They stayed 3 days before relatives from Laramie came to collect them. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Hendricks took Ruth's hands. "I was wrong about you," she whispered. "God bless you. Ruth, Washington." After they left, the drought's grip tightened. More fires sparked across the county, some from lightning. Others suspected arson. Morrison's men seemed to be everywhere, watching, waiting. The well dropped dangerously low. "We need to move the cattle," Caleb decided. "There's a spring-fed pond on the Coleman property, about 10 miles north. They abandoned the place last year, but the water should still be good." "That's a long drive in this heat." Ruth worried. "And if Morrison finds out?" "We lose them all if we don't try." They set out before dawn, Ruth riding alongside Caleb while Martha helped drive their remaining dozen cattle. The animals moved slowly, weakened by thirst and heat. By midday, the sun was brutal, shimmering off the baked earth in waves that made distance impossible to judge. They were 5 miles from the pond when the riders appeared, Morrison and 8 men, armed and positioned to block their path. Well, Morrison called out. "Cattle rustling now. Morgan, these look like my cattle and what's about to be my land. We're moving them to water," Caleb replied evenly. "Unless you want to lose your investment to drought." "My investment?" Morrison laughed. "Boy, I already won. You can't make that payment, and we both know it. I'm just deciding whether to have you arrested for theft or simply take possession now." That's when Ruth noticed the torches several riders carried. Despite the blazing sun, her blood went cold. "You've been setting the fires," she said. Morrison's smile was answer enough. "Terrible tragedy, these drought fires. Amazing how they seem to hit folks who owe me money, almost like God himself wants to clear the land for better use." "You burned out the Hendricks family." Caleb's voice was deadly quiet. "Children could have died, but they didn't, and now their land's available for a reasonable price." Morrison gestured to his men. "Boys, I think we need to inspect these cattle. Make sure they're really Morgan's and not strays from my herds." 2 riders moved forward. That's when Martha, brave, foolish Martha, raised the old shotgun he'd been carrying. "Leave our cattle alone." His young voice cracked with fear and determination. Everything happened fast. One of Morrison's men went for his gun. Ruth screamed. Caleb drew and fired in one motion, his bullet knocking the weapon from the man's hand. Martha's shotgun boomed, the shot going wild but making the horses dance and rear. In the chaos, Ruth spurred her horse between Martha and Morrison's men, shielding her brother with her body. "Don't you touch him! Control your animals. Morgan," Morrison snarled, fighting his spooked mount, "or I'll have you all arrested for attempted murder. Try it." Caleb had his Colt trained steady on Morrison. Explained to the sheriff how a sick boy defending his family's cattle scared 8 armed men. For long moments, they faced off under the killing sun. Sweat ran down faces. Horses stamped nervously, and the dying cattle lowed their distress. Finally, Morrison wheeled his mount around. "1 week, Morgan, payment in full, or I come with the sheriff and legal papers. And next time that brat pulls a gun, I'll put him down like a rabid dog." They thundered off, leaving dust and threats hanging in the air. Ruth's hands shook as she reached for Martha, checking him for injury. The boy was pale but unharmed, clutching the shotgun with white knuckles. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I just wanted to help." "You were brave," Caleb said, but his face was grim. "Too brave. Come on, let's get these cattle to water." They reached the pond as shadows lengthened. The cattle rushed into the water with desperate relief. Ruth collapsed in the shade, exhaustion and delayed fear making her limbs weak. "He'll burn us out," she said. "Before the week's up. He'll burn us like the others." Caleb sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Maybe, but he showed his hand today. If we could prove he's been setting fires, with what witnesses? His own men?" Ruth laughed bitterly. "The law doesn't work for people like us. Caleb, you know that." As if to underscore her words, they saw smoke rising in the distance. Another homestead. Another dream turned to ash. The drought had become Morrison's weapon, and he wielded it without mercy. That night, they took turns standing watch. Ruth found Caleb on the porch at midnight, rifle across his lap, staring into the darkness. "You could still leave," he said without looking at her. "Take Martha. Go to that settlement near Laramie. I'll hold Morrison off long enough." "We've had this conversation." She sat beside him. "Propriety be damned. We stand together or not at all. Ruth, do you know what the Hendricks boy told me? Said his mama cried all night after we took them in. Not from grief, but from shame, because the people she'd scorned showed her more kindness than her own kind. That won't stop Morrison." "No, but it means something. What we've built here means something." She looked at him in the moonlight. "I've lost everything before. Parents, home, hope. I know how to survive loss. What I can't survive is giving up without a fight." Caleb turned to her then, and she saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. "You know we'll likely lose. Then we lose, but we don't surrender." A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another, then another. The sound raised goosebumps on Ruth's arms, wild voices calling across the darkness. Defiant and alive, despite the drought that was killing everything else. "When I was in the war," Caleb said quietly, "there was this battle. We were outnumbered 3-1, no reinforcements coming. The smart thing was to retreat, but our captain, this young fellow from Ohio, he said something I never forgot. Said sometimes you fight not because you can win, but because someone needs to see you try." Who needs to see us try? Martha, the Hendricks family, that preacher who thinks you've lost your way. Everyone who said a black woman and a broken white man couldn't make something worthwhile. He paused. Maybe we need to see it ourselves. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. This man who'd saved her from degradation, who'd offered partnership instead of pity, who stood with her against impossible odds. She'd told him they couldn't acknowledge what grew between them, but facing the likelihood of losing everything, pretense seemed foolish. "Caleb," she began. "I know," he said softly. "Me too, but after we fight Morrison, after we know how this ends, then we'll say what needs saying." She nodded, understanding. Whatever they were to each other deserved better than desperation's shadow. If they survived this, if they somehow kept their land and their dignity, then they could explore the dangerous territory of the heart. Dawn came too soon, bringing another day of merciless heat. As Ruth prepared breakfast with their dwindling supplies, she thought about fighting losing battles and the people who needed to see you try. Morrison would come with fire or law, or both. The drought would continue its slow murder of the land. But this morning, Martha hummed while he did chores. Still proud of his defiance, the cattle they'd saved stood in the shade, alive another day. And Caleb worked beside her, solid and steadfast, preparing for a fight they couldn't win but wouldn't abandon, in this harsh land that tested every soul to breaking. Sometimes the victory wasn't in winning. Sometimes it was in the refusal to kneel, in the bonds forged by shared struggle, in the love that grew in impossible ground. The drought would end, or it wouldn't. Morrison would destroy them, or he wouldn't. But today, Ruth Washington stood in her kitchen, in her home, with her chosen family, and that was its own kind of triumph. Whatever came next, they would meet it together, unbowed, unbroken, unashamed. The water might be running out, but their well of courage had not yet run dry. The rain began as a whisper in the night, so soft that Ruth thought she was dreaming, but the gentle patter on the roof grew stronger, and she sat bolt upright, heart pounding with hope. Through the window, she saw the impossible, water falling from the sky after 2 months of killing drought. "Caleb!" She ran to the barn, not caring that she wore only her nightgown and shawl. "Caleb, wake up! It's raining!" He emerged from his quarters, hair tousled from sleep, and stood with her in the barnyard as the rain soaked them both. Ruth laughed, tilting her face to the sky, tasting the sweet water on her lips. Without thinking, she grabbed Caleb's hands and spun him in a circle, dancing in the mud like children. "We might survive this," she gasped between laughter. "The cattle, the garden, we might actually survive." Caleb caught her against him to keep them both from falling, and suddenly they were standing too close, rain streaming down their faces, hearts beating in rhythm. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then Martha's whoop from the house broke the spell, and they stepped apart. But something had shifted between them, fundamental as the weather. The rain continued for 3 days, steady and life-giving. The creek began to flow again, and the cattle lifted their heads with renewed strength. Ruth and Martha worked frantically to plant new seeds in the garden, racing to take advantage of the moisture, but their joy was short-lived. On the 4th day, as clouds still blessed the land with intermittent showers, Sheriff Coleman arrived with papers. "I'm sorry. Morgan," he said, though he didn't look sorry at all. "Morrison's called in the debt. You've got 24 hours to produce payment in full, or I have to serve eviction." 24 hours? Ruth stepped onto the porch. "The agreement was for a week." Coleman wouldn't meet her eyes. "Morrison says you threatened him with violence. Says the boy pulled a gun on his men. That violates the terms of any agreement." "They were going to burn us out," Martha protested from behind Ruth. "That's a serious accusation. Boy, you got proof?" They all knew the answer. Coleman was Morrison's creature, bought and paid for. Justice was a luxury they couldn't afford. After the sheriff left, they sat around the kitchen table in defeated silence. They'd gathered $90. The horses might bring 50 if they could find a buyer in time. Still over 300 short of salvation? "I'll go to town," Ruth said quietly. "Maybe, Madame Claire?" "No." Caleb's voice was sharp. "We don't trade one kind of servitude for another." "Then what? We lose everything anyway." A knock interrupted her. They exchanged wary glances. Visitors were rare and rarely brought good news. Caleb answered with his hand on his gun. An elderly black man stood on the porch, well-dressed despite the mud. Behind him waited a younger man holding an umbrella. "Mr. Morgan, my name is Cornelius Freeman. I believe you know my nephew, Josiah. He's the preacher who visited some months back." Ruth recognized the family resemblance. "What do you want?" "To repay a debt, Mrs. Washington." The old man's eyes were kind but sharp. "May we come in?" They gathered in the kitchen, where Cornelius Freeman told his story. 20 years ago, he'd been enslaved in Texas. When the war ended, He'd traveled north seeking family, penniless and starving. A white rancher had given him work, shelter, and, more importantly, respect. That rancher was Thomas Morgan, Cornelius said, looking at Caleb. Your father. He gave me a chance when no one else would. I worked for him 2 years, saved my wages, eventually started my own business in Cheyenne. I've done well. Caleb stared at him. I don't remember. You were away at war, and I left before you returned. But I never forgot your father's kindness. When Josiah told me about your situation, about how you'd helped Mrs. Washington. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet. I believe in paying debts forward. He laid $300 on the table. Ruth's hands flew to her mouth. We can't. You can and you will. Cornelius said firmly. This isn't charity. It's justice. Your man here acted with honor, just like his father. That deserves reward, not punishment. I'm not her man, Caleb said automatically, then caught Ruth's eye. That is, we're not, aren't you? Cornelius smiled. Son, I'm old, not blind, and life's too short and too hard to deny love when it finds you. After the Freemans left, promising to return for news of the outcome, Ruth and Caleb sat stunned. With their saved money and this gift, they had enough. They could pay Morrison, keep their land, survive. Your father, Ruth said softly. He must have been a good man. He was. I just wish I'd known about Cornelius. So many stories I'll never hear now. Ruth reached across the table, taking his hand. We'll make new stories, better ones. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the earth refreshed from rain. They rode to town together, Ruth, Caleb, and Martha, carrying their salvation in a worn leather pouch. The streets were muddy but busy, folks emerging after the drought like flowers after rain. Morrison's office sat above the bank, all polished wood and pretension. His face, when they laid the money on his desk, was worth every hardship they'd endured. Count it, Caleb said. $450. Payment in full. Morrison's hands shook as he counted, his face growing redder with each bill. Where did you get this? Does it matter? The debt is paid. This isn't over. Morrison snarled. You think you've won? I own half this county. I can make your lives hell in ways you haven't imagined. Try it. Ruth stepped forward. But know this. We have friends now. The Hendricks family knows you burned them out. Cornelius Freeman has influence in Cheyenne. And we're not afraid anymore. They signed the papers, making the payment official. The clerk, a nervous man who'd clearly hoped to see them evicted, witnessed with reluctant pen strokes. It was done. The land was theirs, free and clear. Outside. Martha whooped and ran ahead, splashing through puddles. Ruth felt lighter than air, as if she might float away without Caleb's steadying hand on her elbow. We did it, she breathed. We did. They stopped at the general store for supplies, real supplies. Not the meager rations they'd survived on. Garrett served them with the same cold courtesy as always, but Ruth didn't care. Let them whisper. Let them judge. She'd kept her family together, kept her dignity, kept her land. Ruth? A familiar voice called. Mrs. Hendricks approached, her children in tow. I heard what happened, what you've done, and I wanted to say, we all wanted to say, thank you. Her eldest boy stepped forward, the same one who'd thrown stones months ago. I'm sorry, Miss Ruth, for everything. Ruth knelt to his level. What's your name? Samuel, ma'am. Well, Samuel. Everybody makes mistakes. What matters is learning from them. She smiled. You come visit us sometime. Martha could use a friend. As the Hendricks family walked away, Caleb watched Ruth with something soft in his eyes. You have a gift, he said, making people better than they thought they could be. Is that what I did with you? Maybe, he helped her onto the wagon. Or maybe we saved each other. The ride home was quiet, each lost in thought. The rain had brought wildflowers blooming across the prairie, painting the land in purples and yellows. Their ranch, when it came into view, looked different somehow. Not the desperate last stand it had been, but a home, a future. That evening, after Martha had gone to bed, protesting that he was too excited to sleep, Ruth found Caleb on the porch watching the sunset paint the clouds in shades of rose and gold. "Cornelius was right," she said, settling beside him. "Life is too short." "Ruth, no, let me speak." She turned to face him fully. "When I walked into that saloon, I was ready to sell my soul. You gave me another choice. You gave me dignity when the world would have stripped it away. And somewhere between that first morning and now, you gave me something else." "What's that?" "Hope, love, a reason to believe in impossible things." She took his weathered hand in hers. "I know what people will say. I know the challenges we'll face. But Caleb Morgan, He kissed her then, gentle and sure, tasting of promise and rain-washed earth. When they parted, both were smiling through tears. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of propriety or what people think, but because I can't imagine facing another drought or storm or Morrison without you beside me." "Yes," Ruth whispered. "Yes to all of it. To the hard times and the good ones. To building something beautiful from broken pieces." Inside the house, Martha pressed his face against the window, grinning widely. His sister had found love, and they'd kept their home. The drought had broken, and with it, the chains of fear that had bound them. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ruth leaned against Caleb's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. The reality of this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Morrison wouldn't give up easily. The town's gossips would have a field day. There would be more droughts, more fires, more tests of their resolve. But tonight, on this porch of this saved home, with this man who'd shown her that honor still existed in a harsh world, Ruth Washington allowed herself to believe in happy endings, not the fairy tale kind, but the real kind, earned through struggle, paid for in courage, and all the sweeter for being unexpected. The spring rain had brought more than water to the parched land. It had brought redemption, love, and the promise of new growth from ground that had seemed hopelessly barren. And, in the gentle evening breeze, Ruth could almost hear her parents' voices, carried from whatever peaceful place good souls rest, whispering their blessing on all that was to come. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and golden, with wildflowers carpeting the prairie in every direction. Ruth stood before the small mirror in her room, wearing her mother's dress, carefully altered and pressed for this day she'd never imagined would come. Martha, dressed in his Sunday best, watched from the doorway. "You look beautiful." "Ruth, do I?" She smoothed the fabric nervously. "I feel like everyone will see right through me, see all the struggles, all the times we almost—" "They'll see a woman who fought for her family," Martha said firmly, sounding older than his 13 years. "They'll see someone who deserves happiness." The ceremony would be simple. A few friends gathered in the meadow behind the house. Josiah Freeman had agreed to officiate, traveling from Laramie despite the whispers it would cause. The Hendricks family would attend, as would Cornelius Freeman and, surprisingly, Mrs. Chen from the boarding house. Caleb waited by the creek, wearing a new shirt Ruth had sewn for him. His face when he saw her approach, wonder mixed with something deeper, made her forget every harsh word, every moment of despair that had brought them to this moment. "Dearly beloved," Josiah began, his voice carrying across the meadow, "we gather here under God's sky to witness something rare in this hard land, love that has grown from adversity, partnership forged in trial, and hope that refuses to die." As they spoke their vows, Ruth thought of all the paths that had led here, the desperate night in the saloon when she'd offered herself to pay debts, the morning Caleb had given her another choice, the countless days of work and worry, building something together that neither could have managed alone. "Ruth," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "you brought life back to a place I'd let die. You showed me that courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about facing each day despite it. I promise to stand beside you through drought and plenty, through whatever storms may come, until my last breath." "Caleb," Ruth replied. "You gave me dignity when the world would have taken it. You saw my worth when others saw only my color and circumstances. I promised to build with you, to fight alongside you, to make this land bloom with the love we've found in its harsh soil." When Josiah pronounced them married, when Caleb kissed her there in the wildflower meadow with their small gathering of witnesses, Ruth felt something settle in her soul, a rightness, a completion of a journey that had begun in desperation and ended in joy. The celebration was modest but genuine. Mrs. Chen had brought a cake. The Hendricks children played with Martha, and even Cornelius Freeman danced a slow turn with Ruth, whispering, "Your parents would be proud." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the guests departed with well wishes and warnings to be careful. Morrison hadn't been seen in town for days, and his silence worried everyone. That night, as Ruth moved her few belongings into the main bedroom, Caleb insisting despite her protests about propriety, she found him standing at the window, watching the darkness. "What is it?" "Too quiet," he said. "Morrison doesn't give up this easy. Let tomorrow worry about tomorrow," Ruth said, taking his hand. Today was ours, but Caleb's instincts proved right. They woke before dawn to the smell of smoke and the orange glow of fire on the horizon. Not their ranch, but close. They dressed quickly and rode toward the flames, finding the Hendricks' new temporary shelter ablaze. The family stood in the yard, safe but watching their second home burn in as many months. This time, though, they weren't alone. Neighbors had gathered, forming bucket brigades, fighting the flames together. "Morrison, Mr." Hendricks said grimly when he saw Caleb. His men were seen riding away just before the fire started. "Did anyone else see them?" "Half the county saw them. He's getting careless, or desperate." Over the next weeks, a pattern emerged. Fires sprouted across the region, always targeting those who'd helped Ruth and Caleb or spoken against Morrison. But something had changed. The community that had once turned away now stood together. When the Baker farm was threatened, riders appeared from every direction to fight the flames. When Morrison's men tried to dam the creek upstream, cutting off water to 3 homesteads, they found armed ranchers waiting. "He's united us," Ruth marveled one evening as she and Caleb returned from helping rebuild yet another burned barn. "His cruelty has done what kindness couldn't, made neighbors out of strangers." The turning point came in late summer. Ruth was hanging laundry when she saw riders approaching, not Morrison's usual thugs, but men in federal badges. "You, marshals, come from Cheyenne." "Mrs. Morgan?" The lead marshal, a weathered man named Davis, touched his hat. "We're looking for Samuel Morrison. Word is he's been setting fires, threatening folks, trying to steal land through intimidation." "What changed?" Caleb asked. "Joining them?" "Morrison's been doing this for years." "Well, sir, seems someone with influence in Cheyenne, a Mr. Cornelius Freeman, has been documenting complaints. And when a federal judge's cousin lost his ranch to suspicious fire last month," Davis smiled grimly. "Let's just say Washington's taking interest now." They found Morrison at his office, trying to burn documents when the marshals kicked in his door. The trial was swift. Too many witnesses, too much evidence, too many powerful people finally paying attention. Morrison was sentenced to federal prison. His ill-gotten lands ordered returned to their rightful owners. The day Morrison was taken away in chains, Ruth stood with Caleb watching the prison wagon disappear into the distance. Around them, the town seemed lighter somehow, as if a shadow had lifted. "It's over," Martha said, joining them. He'd grown 3 inches that summer, turning from boy to young man almost overnight. "No," Ruth corrected gently. "It's beginning." And it was. With Morrison gone, the community that had united against him remained connected. The Hendricks boy, Samuel, became Martha's closest friend. Mrs. Chen started teaching Ruth Chinese cooking in exchange for reading lessons. Even Mr. Garrett at the general store managed a genuine smile when they shopped. Fall arrived with its golden light and harvest plenty. The ranch thrived, cattle healthy, garden abundant, debts paid. Ruth stood in her kitchen, preserving vegetables for winter, when Caleb came in from the fields. "Remember when you first saw this place?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Broken down and half dead. "I saw possibility," Ruth said, leaning into his warmth, "just like I saw in you." And now, she turned in his arms, studying the man who'd become her husband, partner and best friend. The shadows in his eyes had lightened, though they'd never fully disappear. The scar on his jaw had faded to a thin line. His hands, once used mainly for holding a whiskey glass or gun, now built and planted and created. "Now I see home," she said simply. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual that had become sacred to them, Ruth thought about the journey that had brought them here. A desperate woman ready to sacrifice everything. A broken man hiding in a bottle. A sick boy needing medicine. Somehow, from those fragments, they'd built something whole. "Caleb," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her, noting the mixture of joy and nervousness in her eyes. "We're going to need to add another room to the house," she continued, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "Come spring, there'll be 4 of us." The wonder on his face, the careful joy as he pulled her close, was worth every hard mile they'd traveled. They sat together as stars emerged, planning additions to the house, choosing names, dreaming of a future that once seemed impossible. "What do you think your parents would say?" Caleb asked. "About all this?" Ruth smiled, remembering her father's calloused hands and her mother's singing. "I think they'd say we proved something important." "What's that?" "That love doesn't see color or circumstance. That dignity can't be taken, only given away. That sometimes the greatest treasures come from the deepest struggles." She squeezed his hand. "That even in the hardest ground, beautiful things can grow." As if in agreement, a cool breeze swept across the prairie, carrying the scent of sage and possibilities. Inside the house, Martha practiced his letters by lamplight, preparing for the school that would finally accept him come fall. The cattle lowed contentedly in their pasture. The garden rustled with abundance. Ruth closed her eyes and whispered the words Caleb had said to her months ago, words that had become their truth. Black woman offered herself to repay debts, yet, with every kiss, she captured my heart forever. But the story had become so much more than that. It was about 2 broken people who'd found wholeness in each other. About a community learning to see beyond color and prejudice. About the American West not as it was often portrayed, lawless and cruel, but as it could be when people chose courage over fear, love over hate, unity over division. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. The same stars that had witnessed their struggles now bearing witness to their joy. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. It always did. But tonight, on this porch of this saved home, with new life growing and old wounds healed, Ruth and Caleb Morgan sat hand in hand, proof that sometimes, against all odds, love wins. In the distance, a coyote called, not the threatening sound of desperate times, but the wild freedom of creatures at home in their world. Ruth smiled, understanding the feeling completely. She was home. They all were. And that was the greatest miracle of all, the beginning. Thank you so much for joining us on Ruth and Caleb's incredible journey through the Wild West. Their story of love triumphing over prejudice and hardship reminds us that hope can bloom even in the harshest conditions. Where are you listening to this story from? Please share in the comments below. We'd love to connect with our listeners around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Ruth and Caleb's journey. What part of their story touched your heart the most? Let us know in the comments.